Hello everyone and welcome back to Quickflicks, and today we'll be talking about The Eternals, a film that is directed by Chloe Zhao and marks the 26th entry into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The Eternals follows a group of people that are created by the Celestials that are used to take care of the deviant threats throughout the entirety of the Marvel Universe, and they come across Earth and they spend many millennia there. And at the same time, there is this other thing that has been happening called the emergence. Ever since the snap happened, all life in the universe reverted back to its normal state, which had caused enough energy to reawaken this whole thing that's happening called the emergence. And so it's up to the Eternals to find out what that is and to see what they could do to avoid it or stop it. So, Eternals has been kind of in the news lately, especially with quote-unquote nerd outlets, for having a pretty mild Rotten Tomatoes score. Currently, at the start of this video, I've looked on the score. It's 51% for critics and 86% for regular audience members in terms of enjoyability. And let me just say this right up front. Rotten Tomatoes is not a reputable source of how good a quality the film is. It's merely an aggregation score of how much of a percentage of people, both critics and audiences, would recommend the film. And the service itself has had plenty of flaws, especially with critics. I know Chris Stuckman at one point in his career has talked about a review of his that, he gave a pretty positive review for, but ultimately the review was labeled a rotten score. And this whole notion of giving it a percentage range, this sort of percentage grading score, is very subjective. Like, art itself, movies themselves, they're all subjective. Music is subjective. It's all in the eye of the beholder. And whenever people put stock in something like Rotten Tomatoes, you're giving it way too much power. And obviously, if you are a Marvel film fan, you're probably going to go watch this movie, and you might enjoy it. There have been some people I've talked to that feel a little bit mixed about this movie. Personally, having come out of the movie, I can see where some of the problems really do lie with this film. Every Marvel film has problems, but I don't think this is the worst MCU film, by far. My least favorite movie of the Marvel Cinematic Universe is either The Incredible Hulk or Iron Man 2, like very early on Marvel stuff. Nowadays, they're kind of mostly the same. Like, they're all enjoyable popcorn films that do have some really great character moments, and they have some pretty cool action sequences, and they're just perfectly fine and enjoyable films. And now with Phase 4, it seems like they want to do something new, and they want to push into more, different directions. If Shang-Chi wanted to be a little bit more of a, like a kung fu action movie with some magical elements, cool. If Black Widow wants to be like a Jason Bourne style film, cool. Jason Bourne / James Bond, whichever you want to pick it. And now we have Eternals, the third film of the Phase 4 slate. And this is a pretty interesting movie. I will say this is a movie that does have its flaws, and I'll get into those for a second, but I want to first praise the film because the film ultimately has things that I really did appreciate about the film. I love how this film really takes its time to really develop some of its characters. I will say one negative I do have, though, is that some of the characters do feel a little bit one note, and they don't get much characterization. But what's there is actually pretty fine for the most part. I don't think you need to have, all these characters, and all their backstories having to, be fully fleshed out. I think it does just enough to get you to say, okay, well, this is just the team, this is who they are, this is where everyone is from in terms of their background, and I think the film makes it apparent that they're just trying to go for the quick and simple in terms of how these characters have operated. Like, sometimes it could be for the detriment of the film in terms of how much of weight there can be with certain things. There's a character that has something happen to them and they take it very, very personally, and then we cut to decades later and we don't necessarily feel some of the guilt associated with that decision. And I'm not really talking about anyone specifically because I'm trying to be vague. I'm not trying to do spoilers. But let's just say there's a lot of decisions that in this film doesn't necessarily fully carry some of the weight of the themes of the film. But I will say, for the most part, is that the characters and the acting are pretty fine. I think they're really well done for the most part. I liked Makari, the actress who plays Makari, who is a deaf actress. She was amazing in this movie. And I'm really happy that we're getting to see more deaf actors on screen, especially for roles like this. Also, Makari in general, fucking loved it. I loved her speed, and I loved the way that they showed and emphasized how fast this character is. Because whenever you see a speedster in a superhero flick, let's say Days of Futures Past, because that's a very popular one, they usually do this whole like slow down like bullet time thing to emphasize how fast the character is moving, but you don't really get to see how fast that character is moving in reality. So to see how they portray Makari's speed in this movie is actually really cool. Then, of course, you also have to talk about Kumail Nanjiani's character as well. He's a Bollywood sort of actor in this movie, and he does have some pretty decent lines in this one. He has like this whole thing where he has like shooting like like finger blast energies. Like, it's kind of funny. It's goofy, but it's really funny. And then you have Cersei, who's a pretty big character in this movie, and a lot more of a character in this movie, given how the film ends. And I really liked her character for the most part. All the character elevations, all the things that happen with her and what she has to do in this movie, you know, there's a lot of really great moments, I felt, in terms of one of the bigger reveals of this movie and how it personally affects her and how that whole discussion affects everyone else. And I'm really trying to be vague because there's so much I want to talk about with this movie. And of course, there's other characters too that really do make a pretty big standout performance, and I think most people do a really good job. Brian Tyree Henry's character, who has already been confirmed to be the gay character who has a gay kiss, it's pretty normalized. I like the fact they didn't really make it a big deal, but more or less just said, let's just put it in here and make it normal. And they did a pretty good job with that. And they actually gave him a lot more of a character than I thought, because when it comes to Disney in terms of representing LGBT characters, either they'll, you know, undercoat it with subtext or they won't do it at all. And so I'm really happy that Disney allowed for Brian Tyree Henry's character to be gay and to be this, right? Because it adds a lot more diversity to the cast and really brings everything together. As far as the visual effects goes, there is some CG that isn't necessarily great. Some layering issues I've found in this movie, but at the same time, how the film chooses to visualize the Celestials is amazing. Like, the way they show Erisham and how small like certain characters can be next to this character is astounding. And trust me, when you get to the third act, just how massive this gets, it's amazing. It's just amazing. And the key is that you have to watch it on a pretty big screen. I feel like you wouldn't necessarily get the full scope of how really big these characters are. It's just crazy. And also, another thing that really added to my experience of watching Eternals is having already read the Neil Gaiman run that's right here. I found myself at times kind of like recognizing certain things and, you know, being familiar with that story. There was some things that, you know, I was like, okay, well, maybe they'll mention that. And then sometimes they have a little bit of a diversion from that, but still ultimately retain some of the essence of that. There is some things that happen in this book that kind of get retrofitted into this movie in a way I found mostly satisfying. And plus, there's some visual Easter eggs too. There's one thing that happens in London. One character shows up with a dog, and if you're familiar with that whole thing, you might be familiar with, you know, that character. But I'm not saying it's who you think it is, but it's there. Now, in terms of my negatives, I only have like maybe a couple negatives. Again, I've already mentioned the CG. There is some CG stuff that could have been better handled. Maybe give it a little bit more time to process or something. I'm not entirely sure what they could have done to fix some of the VFX shots, but a large majority of them were fine, and some of them were fantastic. Another thing, too, is the dialogue. I felt like the dialogue at times was just kind of wooden. which is such a weird contrast because the message of this movie is actually kind of heartwarming and it's actually interesting to think about. But at the same time, you also have this wooden dialogue which just contrasts with this whole thing. It really conflicts with it. And I would have punched up the dialogue just a little bit. Maybe add some ad-libbing, allow the actors to ad-lib some of these lines, because sometimes the lines and dialogue were kind of wooden. And surprisingly enough, there has been a lot of people that said that the 2 hour and 35-minute runtime was a little bit too long for them, but to me, I didn't really feel a lot of the running time, which is just weird to me. Usually with films like this long, sometimes I could feel where the films are dragging. And the only real place I could find that really dragged was probably in like a 30-minute segment in the middle of the movie, and that's it. The rest of the 2 hours that I watched was actually kind of fine, and I was pretty fine with the pace, the general atmosphere of this film. But I will say it doesn't necessarily work for everyone. I don't think this film will work for everyone. I think some people will still have a problem with the characters being one note in some areas. I do feel like some people will still criticize this movie for having VFX. I know some of those people online, and it's kind of weird. But I think the main thing, though, for me is that I didn't necessarily feel a really big connection to these characters. There's only like one real connection I really found, and that's with Thena, who's played by Angelina Jolie, who's fabulous in this movie. Not a lot of time is given to her, but when we do get to see her, she actually has a pretty sad story involving some memory stuff, and that's about it. And I found some emotionality within that character, but this film, by the end of it, I heard other people's reactions to this movie. I heard that they were crying outside the movie. I heard that they were doing all this stuff, but to me, I felt like it was okay. I felt like by the end of it, I thought it was just kind of a fine movie. There was some emotional highs in this movie, and there was some really, really cool action sequences involving the entire team and mixing and matching their different unique traits, and that's also something that I really like. Something that isn't necessarily utilized a lot in these Marvel movies is how those team dynamics work, and I feel like Eternals really did a pretty decent job at doing that. But yeah, in summation, Eternals is an interesting film from Chloe Zhao because this is the third film she's ever done, and this is her first blockbuster she's ever done. And while the dialogue could have been, better just a little bit to help add to the charming performances from all of our leads, even though all of that is there, I found myself at the end of the day being like, it was a pretty fun movie. There's some things I really liked about the movie, and there's some things that do kind of hold it back for me for being like a really great movie. But to me, it's probably within my top 15 MCU movies. Probably next, like closer to 15 and not necessarily close enough to like 10 or 9. But Eternals is a pretty fine movie. I think it's just okay. And don't get me wrong, there are some amazing stuff that happens in this movie. There is some really awesome stuff, like in general, but at the same time, I don't think it would crack my top 10. Just in my opinion. So I'm going to give Marvel's Eternals a B-. Thank you guys so much for watching my review of Marvel's Eternals. I would like to know from you guys what you thought of the film. What do you think of the ending? What do you think of the special effects? What do you think in general for this movie? And what do you hope to see in the future of the MCU, like, as a fan? So, I'll see you guys in the next review. Peace.